Góðan daginn, gott fólk og verið hjartalega velkomin á Janúarráðstefnu Festu, stærsta sjálfbærni viðburð sem haldin hér á landi og ber í ár yfirskriftina á réttum forsendum. For our English-speaking viewers and keynote speakers, welcome to this year's Festa's January conference. The first hour will be in English, but first, a few words in Icelandic before I introduce our amazing keynote speakers this year. Á næstu 3 tímum ætlum við að hlýða á rockstjörnur og leiðandi hugsuði á sviði sjálfbærni alþjóðlega. Þau Johann Rockström, einn höfunda þolmarka jarðar, og Kate Raworth, höfund kleinurhringjahagfræðinnar. Við höfum verið að safna spurningum frá fólki síðustu daga og vikur og höfum tækifæri til að leggja þær fyrir þau að loknum þeirra erindum. Eftir stutt hlé hlýðum við svo á erindi formanns Festu. Við rýnum í erindi aðalfyrirlesaranna í þaulskipulegum pallborðsumræðum hér á eftir, þar sem lykilaðilar úr heimi fjármála, laga, fyrirtækjareksturs, innviða, hagsmunagæslu og akademíu ræða hvernig fjármagn getur verið helsti aflgjafi í átt að sjálfbærni, hvernig lög, reglur og upplýsingagjöf fyrirtækja munu leiða til sjálfbærni og í þriðja lagi greinum við það stóru umbreytingar í orkuskiptum í heiminum í dag og þróun yfir í hringrásarhagkerfið sem munu leiða okkur úr hákolefnahagkerfi yfir í lágkolefnahagkerfi. Að lokum fáum við endurgjöf frá fulltrúum ungu kynslóðarinnar. Við kynnum með stolti fyrir ykkur hvaða háskólanemendur voru valdir aðildi í ár. Aðildi svona fellowship-verkefni hjá Festu sem í ár unnið með einu af stofnaðilum að Festu, Össur. Síðan muni draga saman helstu niðurstöður ráðstefnunnar og við kveðjumst þar til ári. Janúarráðstefnan öllum opin og streymt á öllum helstu fjölmiðlum á Íslandi. Við þökkum styrktaraðilunum fyrir að gera okkur þetta kleift. Aðalstyrktaraðilunum Landsbankinn og Arionbanki og styrktaraðilunum Sjóvá, Íslandsbanka, Kviku, Eimskip, Sænska sendiráðinu og atvinnuvegaráðuneytinu. Kærar þakkir fyrir ómetanlegan stuðning og að gera okkur kleift að halda þessa ráðstefnu. Seinna í dag og á komandi dögum, vikum, mánuðum og vonandi árum verður hægt að nálgast ráðstefnuna á heimasíðu Festu og YouTube-rás Festu fyrir þá sem ekki ná að horfa í beinni. Eins og síðastliðin ár þá Janúarráðstefna Festu kolefnisjöfnuð. Hér í Hörpu í dag hefur allt verið sett upp til að fylgja gildandi sóttvarnareglum. Öllum þátttakendum skipt upp í 10 manna hólf. Grímur eingöngu teknar niður þegar að komið á svið og þar haldin 2 metra regla. Allt eins og það á að vera. I am honored and privileged to present to you our first keynote speaker today and world-renowned scientist, Dr. Johan Rockström. First, a bit in Icelandic and then I'll turn to English. Johann alþjóðlega viðurkenndur vísindamaður og hafa hans rannsóknir beinst að þrautseigju vistkerfa jarðar. Í sumar kom út heimildamynd störf hans á Netflix sem sjálfur David Attenborough talar yfir. Rockström þekktastur fyrir að leiða hóp vísindamanna við greiningu á 9 þolmörkum jarðar sem kallast á ensku Planetary Boundaries. Við höfum þegar farið yfir nokkur af þessum þolmörkum og það hefur óútreiknanleg áhrif á vist og veðurkerfi jarðar. Það hægt að fá að lesa meira Johann á heimasíðu Festu undir viðburðir á samfélagsábyrgð.is. Johann Rockström is an internationally recognized scientist for his work and leadership on global sustainability and the planetary boundaries. The 9 planetary boundaries fundamentally outline what has been called a safe operating space for humanity. If we cross these boundaries, there is no humanity. This framework helps guide governments, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, businesses considering sustainable development. Johan Rockström's keynote today is called Beyond Building Back Better, the role of nature in a post-COVID world. Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and wonderful to be with you. What I want to do in the next 20 minutes is to give you a scientific update on the challenges we're facing over the next decade and decades to come in terms of a transformation towards a safe operating space, and not only within safety, but also allowing prosperity and equity for humanity on Earth. And the place to start is, not surprisingly, in Glasgow, where humanity joined Glasgow in November last year on a pathway to disaster. We have overwhelming scientific evidence that we are on a path that would take us to a 2.7 degrees Celsius global mean temperature rise by the end of this century, in only less than 80 years' time. This is a place we haven't been in for the past 4 to 5 million years. It is a disaster point. We left Glasgow on a pathway to danger, meaning that if all countries would implement the pledges, the nationally determined contribution updates, the methane pledges, the deforestation pledges, the net zero pathways that were put on the table in Glasgow, the best estimates is that we could hold the 2 degrees Celsius line. So we went in disaster, we leave potentially in danger. But the latest science, which you see to the left on this graph, is actually showing that there's so much at stake. Unpublished research now in review shows that already at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have moderate risks of crossing tipping points that would push the Earth system irreversibly away from livable conditions for humanity. And that already at between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, we actually have high risks of destabilizing big global commons such as the Arctic ice shelf, the Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, and I'll come back to these. So the more the science advances, the higher is the risk at very early stages of global environmental change to trigger irreversible changes, which is a very strong scientific support for the need of a planetary boundary framework. Already in 2009, the planetary boundary science suggested that something like 1.3, 1.4 degrees Celsius is the climate planetary boundary. Beyond that, we take rising risks. There is scientific uncertainty, but the risks are high. So essentially, we're still following a trajectory towards high risk, and science is advancing and showing more and more that lower temperatures is the only safe future we have. And the implications are already today proving that we're in the middle of a global climate crisis. For the first time last year, we had rain falling at the highest peak of Greenland. We have mass loss on all glaciers in the world. And just look at the spike on Iceland, one of the hotspot regions on planet Earth, because we have an amplification of global warming, which means that Iceland, Greenland, northern Canada is warming twice as fast as the planet on average. We have a situation where now the IPCC shows clearly not only that the severity of extreme events are increasing, but even the frequency. We get more heat waves, more extreme rainfall, more extreme droughts, more forest fires, and they are more severe, and they're attributed to human-caused global warming. And remember, this is happening already at 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming, which is the warmest temperature since we left the last ice age, but it's still quite far away from 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the emissions continue rising. The 2021 data shows that we have not bent the global curve of emissions yet, and the journey we have to follow is a tremendous exponential journey to net zero within one generation. Why? Because the IPCC shows clearly, this is the graph from the latest assessment, that to be able to have a landing possibility at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we only have something like 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining in the global carbon budget to have a 67% chance of a soft landing at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is again a manageable threshold, but already causing major impacts. But why do we get 400 gigatons of remaining carbon budget? Well, and this is the focus of my talk here, it's not enough to only phase out fossil fuels. No, you see, the only reason the climate models gives us still some degrees of freedom to land safely at net zero by 2050 is that it assumes a transition of land use in agriculture from being the single largest emitter, shown here in dark brown, the wedge you see to the left here, to transition into becoming the world's largest net sink of carbon dioxide, shown in orange, an agricultural sustainability revolution. But even more importantly, it assumes that nature will continue to be our best friend. In green, absorbing roughly 25% of carbon dioxide in terrestrial intact ecosystems on land, and another 25%, even more than 25% actually, in the ocean. So overall, the only chance we have of, one, landing softly at 1.5 within the climate planetary boundary, and two, to be able to still allow ourselves, let's say, an orderly phase out of fossil fuels to have 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide remaining, is that we stay within planetary boundaries. We have to return really fast so that we can keep the carbon sinks in nature intact. That's the only chance we have to be able to deliver. That is why the planetary boundary framework has become, largely a guide to be able to navigate the transformations required in the Anthropocene. We have 9 planetary boundaries that science now shows clearly are the system that regulates the state and stability of the Earth system. Climate is just one of the 9, but not surprisingly, land, freshwater, biodiversity, and the 2 big cycles of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, are also planetary boundaries. And these are the biosphere boundaries that regulates the ability of the Earth system to be able to sequester carbon, cycle elements, and cycle energy and water, and keep air clean. 4 of the 9 boundaries in 2015 were assessed to be transgressed beyond the safe operating space. Climate, biodiversity, land use, and biogeochemical flows, meaning overuse of nitrogen and phosphorus. Just 2 weeks ago, a new paper was released showing that we also transgressed a 5th boundary, namely what we call novel entities, which is chemical pollutants and the accumulation of human-created chemical elements in the Earth system. So we are truly in a danger zone and need to move fast very rapidly, and the only chance of even landing climate is actually to take care of nature in a responsible way. Now, the journey to a safe landing on the climate part, to stay within the 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide, is dramatic. Just look here at what net zero pledges means for the big economies in the world. China is just increasing its emissions, the world's largest emitter today. Look at that landing zone, which, even if it's too late, net zero by 2060, is a dramatic exponential journey of more than 10% reductions per year of emissions. Look at the United States, the European Union. Here we're talking of massive transitions towards a net zero future, and at the same time transitioning to sustainable management of the entire biosphere. So therefore, dear friends, is why science is forced to look at this little beautiful Earthrise from the Christmas Eve Apollo 8 picture from 1968, and today scientifically have to ask the question, are we at risk of destabilizing the whole system? And what will it take to return back to a safe space? And here is the latest data on this. Here is the classic map that came out 1 year before the first Planetary Boundary Science was published on the tipping element systems that we have scientific evidence regulates the climate system. This has been updated, and just 1 year, 2 years ago now, we mapped all these tipping element systems and could show the scientific evidence of the 9 of the known 15 systems that are starting to show signs of instability. And these 9 are shown in this map. The planetary boundary framework is quantifying safe boundaries to avoid that these are pushed across tipping points. And you see here, you're very close to home with the Arctic sea ice, the Greenland ice sheet, being essentially a ground zero, not only because they are approaching risks of tipping point, but also because they're connected with many of the other tipping elements. These connections we call cascades. And in the 10 new insights in climate science, published just before Glasgow, handed over to Patricia Espinosa at the UNFCCC, shows that the latest science is something that we really need to take on board, namely the interactions, cascade, domino effects we risk if we push some of these tipping elements too far. So just to give you one example shown here, the Greenland ice sheet is melting fast and it's releasing cold fresh water into the North Atlantic. This slows down the Atlantic overturning of heat, the Gulf Stream. This slowdown impacts the position of the tropical monsoon systems over both West Africa and South America. This can explain the higher frequency of droughts and forest fires over the Amazon rainforest, which in turn leads to a pulse of carbon into the atmosphere, an amplifier of warming. But not only that, the slowdown of the overturning of heat locks in more warm surface water in the Southern Ocean, which in turn leads to a feedback of accelerated melting of the West Antarctic ice shelf. So you have a situation where the amplified warming on Iceland and on Greenland and the Arctic is connected all the way down to the functioning of another tipping element, the Amazon rainforest, and the stability of the Antarctic ice shelf. This is what we need to learn. Here you have an unpublished map where we are doing an update right as we speak of the 15 to 20 big tipping point systems that we need to keep stable to have the chance of a thriving, equitable future for humanity on Earth. You can just see from this map that it's not only the big ice sheets, it's not only the heat in the ocean, it's also the big natural ecosystems on land. It's the temperate forest, the boreal forest, the wetlands, the peatlands, the permafrost, the Amazon and the Congolese and Indonesian rainforests. So here we have a situation where we have to take an integrated approach where all the planetary boundaries matter. Our latest assessment of why I, in the first slide, could say that already 1.5 degrees Celsius is a risk point for us comes from our latest assessment of the temperature thresholds of these tipping elements. And here you have the graph, also unpublished data. Look at the 5 systems to the furthest left here, that these red embers columns here is the uncertainty range in science. The average point of risk for crossing tipping points is shown in the dotted line. And look at the Greenland ice sheet. We today have uncertainty range between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius, but an average point which is actually even below 1.5 in terms of risk of crossing an irreversible point of no return. So it's really so much at stake at this point of a necessity of a turnaround. And just to take one step back to give you the perspective of the Earth system, what you see here is the first time a climate model has been able to reproduce the state of the climate on planet Earth over the past 3 million years, the entire quaternary. This is what you see on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have global mean temperature. The 0 point is the pre-industrial average temperature on Earth, 14 degrees Celsius. And the green line shows the reproduction with only physical and mathematical equations of the Earth's dancing in ice ages, interglacials, ice ages, interglacials, the last 3 million years. The only thing I want you to kind of take in here is, if you look at this graph, not at one point have we passed 2 degrees. The Earth system has had as its warmest point below 2 degrees, warm interglacials, and deep ice age is roughly -4 degrees. That's the corridor of life. -4 deep ice age, under 2 the warmest point. And now we are rushing to a point that would take us to 2.7 degrees Celsius. In my mind, do we need more than this graph as a justification for rapid action? I would say no. But it's even more dramatic than that. We have more and more scientific evidence why the planet has been able to stay within this narrow corridor, and it is thanks to the resilience in the Earth system. It's the ability of the ocean and land to absorb and dampen the stresses and forcing caused by, before we started burning fossil fuels, solar radiative variations, and now caused by us. The IPCC 6 assessment actually concludes that 56% of our burning of fossil fuels and land use change, the carbon dioxide emitted by us, has been absorbed by terrestrial ecosystems and the ocean. So over half of our debt is subsidized by planet Earth. Unfortunately, we have more and more science like this showing that capacity on land, at least, is showing cracks. The Brazilian part of the Amazon rainforest has already tipped over the last 10 years from a carbon sink to now being a carbon source. This is what makes science really nervous. And the IPCC confirms this important understanding of the longer time scale. The last 100,000 years, we've actually never passed 1 degree Celsius warming, and the IPCC concludes the need to recognize the incredible pace of change and how dependent we are on the stability and resilience of nature to buffer and absorb the changes. Back to Iceland and other coastal countries and human settlements in the world, the sea level rise is continuing at a 3.4 millimeters per year, 3 centimeters per decade. This is a linear trend. We are facing something like 60 to 100 centimeters this century. But remember, we're just at the very early stage of a long-term unstoppable trend. This is IPCC data. Even if we're able to land at 1.5, this is the box you see to the furthest left, the long-term commitment on sea level rise, even if the short-term commitment, we're talking 50 to 90 centimeters by this end of this century, the long-term commitment is 2 to 3 meters over a 2,000-year period. If we hold, not able to hold the 1.5 line, but end at 2 degrees Celsius, we would have more than 6 meters of long-term commitment. This is because of the inertia and the unstoppable, irreversible changes that would be triggered, particularly from the West Antarctic ice shelf, Antarctica, thermal expansion of the ocean, and on Greenland. So however we twist and turn this, there's so much at stake. There's science showing that at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would push coral reef systems across tipping points. We have so much evidence that the West Antarctic ice shelf is more sensitive than we've previously thought, and that the climate planetary boundary is confirmed around 1.5. We also have data, as you know, in the Arctic that things are changing faster than we had anticipated. So again, the Arctic region and Antarctica is giving us so much evidence in support of planetary boundaries. But this is not enough. And what really concerns me is that we don't understand that the reason why things are, despite the fact that things are changing fast now, they're changing much more slower than they otherwise would have done, which is thanks to the ocean. The ocean is absorbing 95% of the heat caused by our fossil fuel burning and 25% of the carbon dioxide. This is extraordinary, and we depend on it, but it's also causing impacts on the ocean biology. Now, we have recently shown that the ocean stability in the future will probably be the decisive factor, and science is quite uncertain of the future here. But when we look on land, on the other hand, we start seeing that the ability of the land system to continue absorbing 25% of our greenhouse gas emission debt is starting to be reducing gradually. And in a paper that we published recently in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we show that if it hadn't been for the ability of the nature planetary boundaries to stay healthy, we would already today have had 0.4 degrees Celsius warmer temperature than we see at 1.2 today. In short, if we hadn't had nature, we would already have crashed through 1.5. Unfortunately, when you look into the future, it's uncertain whether this capacity of buffering will continue because of forest fires, disease patterns, droughts, and human expansion of agriculture and infrastructure into natural habitats. So to close, I really want to strongly argue that science shows so clearly that we have to redefine sustainable development in the Anthropocene. Now we're talking about human well-being and equity within planetary boundaries. We have to have, at any scale, if we are in Iceland, a company, a financial institution, or a community, we now need to connect to the entire planet. Economically, this is now starting to really be understood. The Sarpatha Dasgupta Commission, which was published last year by the UK government, really showed a new direction for economics. The economics within planetary boundaries, something that Kate Raworth will be talking about following my talk here. And I'm really excited about this growing understanding that we need to have an economy that develops within a safe operating space of a stable and resilient Earth system, and that this is strong sustainability. It translates to regulatory means, to economic policies that forces societies and economies to stay within the boundaries of a stable Earth system. So I would put, in my handover to Kate, of course, humanity, equity, prosperity, justice, right within that safe operating space, and that is the, let's say, the guiding mindset that we need to have a chance in this quite turbulent but also very important transition phase for humanity on Earth. Is there then something positive around the corner? Well, I would say yes. I mean, I haven't talked anything about that. I could spend an equal or even much longer time to add up all the positive trends of the fact that we're starting to see an ability to tip over also on a social tipping point towards accelerated journey towards a safe landing. So the risks are high, time is running out, but we're also seeing progress and movement and technologies and scalability. There's no longer utopia to reach a safe operating space. It's about pace and scale. With that, I hand back the word to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johan, for this amazing, informative talk. And it's just incredible how much of an overview you can pack in to 20 minutes. And I highly recommend the book Breaking Boundaries to anyone. It's a book that I couldn't put down, and it's really, I really admire your life's work, among others, just to give us the big context of things and how everything is interconnected. I am honored and privileged to present to you our second keynote speaker today, world-renowned economist and thinker Kate Raworth. First a bit in Icelandic, and then I'll turn over to English. Kate Raworth höfundur kleinuhringjahagfræðinnar. Kleinuhringjahagfræðin leitast við að finna jafnvægi milli grunnþarfa fólks innan þolmarka jarðar. Hugmyndir Raworth kleinuhringjahagfræðina hafa síðustu ár haft gríðarlega mikil áhrif allan heim, og má þar nefna borgir á borð við Amsterdam og Barcelona sem hafa verið að taka þessa aðferðafræði og hugmyndafræði upp. Fjölmargar hreyfingar á borð við Extinction Rebellion, allsherjarþing Sameinuðu þjóðanna og páfann í Róm. Meira að finna Kate á heimasíðu Festu á samfélagsábyrgð.is undir viðburðir. Kate Raworth is a renegade economist focused on making economics fit for the 21st century. She is the creator of the Donut of Social and Planetary Boundaries and co-founder of Donut Economics Action Lab. Her internationally best-selling book, Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, has been translated into over 20 languages and has been widely influential with diverse audiences from the UN General Assembly to Pope Francis to Extinction Rebellion. Kate Raworth's keynote today is Can Iceland Live in the Donut? Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to join you all this morning, but I have to be very honest. It is very difficult to follow Johan Rockstrom, because if our ears and eyes are open to what he's saying, he is showing us in one graph after another that we are witnessing and we are collectively responsible for bringing about the death of the living planet on which we all depend. That is the process that we are undertaking in every graph he's showing us. So it makes me want to sit in silence and consider myself, my nation, the world that I'm part of. But I have 20 minutes, and so I won't sit in silence. I will build upon what he's saying and ask, therefore, what must we do? And since we are focusing on your community in Iceland, today I ask, how can Iceland live within the donut? This donut I'm going to introduce is not something to eat. It is something to make us think differently. But I want to start by recognizing that across the world, the 21st century has begun with repeated crises, from the financial meltdown of 2008, which hit your nation particularly hard, along with many others. We know we are in an era of climate and ecological breakdown, which Johan has just described in such painful detail. There have been massive protests around the world rising up amongst environmental defenders. But 2020 was the most dangerous year in recorded history to be an environmental defender, because there's also been a rise in crackdown against protesters. There's been murder, suppression, and police violence back against those who are defending the life support systems of our planet. And then we have all just endured 2 years of COVID lockdown. These crises tell us a lot. They tell us how profoundly we are connected with each other and with the rest of the living world. They show us that their impacts hit with sharp inequalities upon people, inequalities of gender, of race, of wealth and power, inequalities between the global north and the global south. And though these crises are reported differently in the news, I think they are profoundly connected by the fact that they all arise from humanity's systems that presume and pursue endless expansion. A financial system seeking to expand endlessly will end in a meltdown. When we endlessly increase our use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources, we break down the climate and Earth's web of life. When we endlessly expand human settlements into wildlife areas coupled with global flights, we create perfect conditions for zoonotic disease transfer and a global health pandemic. So we must transform. We must move away from the vision that success and progress depends upon endless growth and expansion, because it doesn't. This is destroying us. Instead, we need a new starting point, and that's where the donut comes in. Think of it as a compass for human prosperity in the 21st century. The goal? Leave nobody in the hole in the middle. Leave no one falling short on the essentials of life without food, water, healthcare, housing, political voice, income. These come from the Sustainable Development Goals. So every government in the world agrees that every person in the world has a right to these essentials. Leave no one in the hole. But as we seek to meet people's essential needs, we know we use Earth's resources, we convert land, we use water, we've been using fossil fuels. And so we start to put pressure on life support systems of our planet. And these, of course, around the outside are the very planetary boundaries that Johan has just been speaking of. So the goal is to leave no one in the hole, but don't overshoot the limits. We need to live in that green, safe, and just space for humanity where we can thrive. If this is the goal, we are very far from it now, as all of the red shows. Millions and billions of people worldwide still can't meet the most basic needs of life. They don't have food and water and housing and electricity. They don't have income or political voice. And we are already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. As you once said, we've been overshooting. We've known we've overshooting on climate change, on converting too much land. We are using too much fertilizer wastefully. We are breaking down the web of life. And then just last week, Earth system scientists said, and now we are looking at chemical pollution, especially plastics, and we are massively overshooting that too. So this is where we are. This is our selfie of humanity and the living world. When we see this, we can't unsee this. This must be our map, our guide, our sense of progress by which we judge every policy, globally, nationally, and locally. Are we turning this story around? Because this is what our children and their children will judge us for. How do we turn this around? I'm showing you a global story, but of course, most policymaking happens much closer to home, and the story between countries varies hugely. Researchers at Leeds University and my colleague at Donut Economics Action Lab have created these national donuts, downscaling as best as possible with the data we have, to look at the difference between nations, and you can see huge differences. Malawi, millions of people falling short on the essential needs. They are not putting pressure on the planet. China, a double whammy of falling short and already an overshoot. We've got Norway, perhaps the closest country to Iceland, because they weren't able to quantify Iceland in this study, doing very well on meeting the essential needs of people, but massively overshooting planetary boundaries, as is Sweden, as is Finland, and the UK, where I come from, and the Netherlands, where I'm sitting. And then United States, even more overshooting planetary boundaries. To me, this diagram says there is not one country in the world that has the right to say we are a developed nation. We are an advanced nation. No, we're not. There is nothing developed or advanced about overshooting the limits of our planet and destroying the prospects of all other people. So I invite everybody to catch yourself whenever you say the word developed countries, because there aren't any. We are all on journeys of transformation, and we are not moving anything like fast enough. So how can we transform? We need to move into this donut from both sides at the same time. How? We must transform the dynamics of our economies. We must make them regenerative by design and distributive by design. Let me say more on this. So we've inherited economies with an industrial design that is linear and degenerative by design. We take Earth's materials, we make them into stuff we want. We use it for a while, often just once, and then we throw it away. And this is what pushes us over planetary boundaries and is running down the planet. We must transform this dynamic into a regenerative design, where resources are not used up, they are used again and again and again, and we restore and repair the damage that we have done so that we start to belong and work with and within the cycles of this living world. What does that look like? Well, I'm sitting in the city of Amsterdam, which has committed to put circularity of resource use at the heart of its strategy, circular construction, so that districts like this one are using materials again and again. Oslo has a car-free city center that's moving fossil fuels out of mobility, but also on the biological, natural systems, regenerative agriculture. As Johan said, agriculture must go from releasing carbon to storing carbon, repairing our relationship to the carbon cycle. And cities, like here in Vancouver, must make us belong again, even in our local ecosystems. There are many, many other ways that we can become regenerative by design. And I invite you to ask yourself and look around, how are we already doing this in Iceland? And what more must we do? We've also inherited economies that can be very divisive by design, through infrastructure, through regulation, through privilege, through power. They capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few. And this is why we see the rise of the global 1%. As Oxfam just reported, over the last couple of years, 10 billionaires in the world have just doubled their wealth, while 99% of people have seen their incomes fall. How can we transform this insane dynamic and create economies that are distributive by design, so that we ensure that value and opportunity that is created is shared far more equitably with everybody who co-creates it? How can we do this? If we bring our thinking to just the scale of cities. Again, I'm sitting in Amsterdam watching bicycles whiz past in the street outside. In this city, when it comes to mobility, the bike is definitely king. Pedestrians come second. The tram comes third, and cars are last. It is a democratizing, distributive way of making mobility affordable and accessible for all. When we're putting solar panels installed in our city, who owns those solar panels? Is it a multinational corporation extracting the value for its shareholders worldwide and its tax havens who know where? Or is it owned locally by the community, so that the value of generating clean energy is reinvested where you are? Social housing, it must be low carbon and it must be affordable. How do we combine the social and the ecological in the cities where we live? And how do we open up employment opportunities to people who have been excluded? In Cleveland, in the US, the local hospital extends opportunities to people living in the nearby neighborhood, bringing women back from maternity leave, bringing people with one conviction, giving them a second chance, equitable chances in the new economy. So we need to be regenerative and distributive by design. Let me bring the focus to your nation, and I invite you to explore this question through the lens of the donut. Can Iceland live in the donut? What would that mean? So we can unroll the donut, open out a space that we can dive inside, and then you can use it to imagine creating the future you want. And it becomes like a canvas for imagining your own possibilities. So here's the question. How can Iceland become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And inside that question are 4 questions. They fall into the 4 squares of this canvas. There are local aspirations for your nation, but also your global responsibilities to the world. So the first question, how can all the people of Iceland thrive? What does that mean? What does it mean to thrive in Iceland? Only you can answer that question, because it's a question for your culture, your place, respecting the diversity of people who are there, ensuring that everybody is over the social foundation and can meet life's needs. How do you do that in your communities? Also, how can Iceland's cities and settlements be as generous as the wildland next door? Nature is generous everywhere. She sequesters carbon. She houses wildlife. She stores water after a storm. She cleans the air. How can we create cities and settlements that aim to be as generous as her through so many ways? And that will make our cities and settlements far more resilient to the climate and impact changes that we already know are built into this system. So these are the local aspirations of place. But we know that every nation, however remote it may be on planet Earth, however small it may think it is, every nation is connected through global supply chains, through global trade rules and relationships to people and planet worldwide. So we also ask, how can Iceland respect the health of the whole planet? Think of the food, the electronics, the clothing, the construction materials that are imported every day into your nation, and then the stream of waste that is exported. That has a global carbon and material footprint. And Iceland, like every high-income country, is overshooting planetary boundaries. So how are you going to reduce your impact on the whole planet? Through transforming your economy to a circular one, through reducing the consumption of material means. And then lastly, think again of those supply chains and think of the people. Think of the people in all those supply chains who make the clothes, who pick the food, who dig the materials. How do we respect their rights too? These are the 4 lenses of what we call diving into the unrolled donut. And we have been exploring these with cities and regions worldwide. We began in 2019 with Amsterdam, where I am today, in Portland and in Philadelphia in the US. Policymakers from across the cities said this is so valuable to sit together and to recognize how all of our roles are interconnected. Everything is connected. We must come up with policies that see the holistic connections between things, that make a social just transition as well as an ecological one. We've worked particularly in Amsterdam to create a city portrait through those 4 lenses. They have turned this into a vision for a circular strategy to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. And then put this at the heart of their circular policy, 100% circular by 2050, 50% circular by 2030, and 10% circular government procurement from this year. This is the beginning of a strategy of transformation, and now they must do it. They're starting in clothing and textiles, in food and in procurement. Other cities across Europe, across the world, need to follow this scale of ambition. Nanaimo in Canada, inspired by Amsterdam, took the concept of the donut, turned it into their own tool, and have started using it in local planning processes, comparing different options for mobility futures. How do they each impact on the donut? Is it socially just? Is it ecologically sound? How shall we move forward? Using this as a guide for reimagining and remaking the future. I'm talking at city scale, but actually even at the neighborhood scale, people are doing incredible work. An organization called Civic Square in Birmingham in the UK are using this very same framework to explore at the level of a neighborhood. How do we transform these streets? How do we help every resident here understand our interconnectedness with the world? So this tool can be used nationally, city level, even locally. It gets kids involved. It makes everybody start to understand how we can all be part of transforming our economies. So let me finish. This, to me, this donut is the vision of human flourishing in the 21st century. And economic success is only success if it's contributing to this goal. That must be the vision of what we judge our economies by, our financial systems, our industries, our policies. We need to transform dynamics from degenerative industry and financing degenerative industry to financing regenerative industry, from divisive designs to distributive designs. So I invite you in every breakout session, in every panel discussion that follows this, hold these as the judges of the policies and the propositions you're hearing. Are we moving to regenerative? Are we moving to distributive? If we're not, why would we be doing this? And how can we move much faster? And I invite you to explore Iceland's own future through these four lenses of the donut. We are going to be releasing the tools of this four lens exploration very soon. And I hope it will be useful in your own journey of transformation. So let me finish by saying, if you're interested in the ideas I've been sharing, I invite you to check out what's happening at Donut Economics Action Lab. There's our web address. You can browse the tools, see what other people are making and contributing, because I believe the transformation we all need to make, we will only make by learning from each other and learning fast and sharing openly, because this is what it takes for the speed and scale of transformation that we know these times demand. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate and Johan, for your insightful, very sobering, but also very inspiring talks, full of vitamins and guidelines and nudges and things to think about. So there are so many questions that we have for you guys, but I have to say that just listening to you both, and especially when you started, Kate, I couldn't help thinking the sentence, "Don't look up." The film that many of us have seen, and I think it's one of the most popular films to see, at least on Netflix now in Iceland and in different countries. Maybe a question for both of you, to start with you, Johan. Towards the end of your talk, you talked about tipping points when it comes to development in the right direction. You know, the social one, I mean, we have demonstrations around the world now with students' demonstrations, which are, the biggest in history ever. So we have economical, political, and technological tipping points, if I remember correctly. The transition to net zero and net positive will require huge capital spending, a substantial scale up from today's levels, like you mentioned. This needs to be a universal transition, and it probably will be pretty front-loaded. What are your thoughts on how to finance that? Who will pay for the transition?
Yeah, thanks. And let me just start by saying that I think what Kate presented here is across all facets of approaches and methods and insights we have, one of the most, relevant and operational and important guides for us to navigate our future. I mean, we know that if we don't take this integrated approach of respecting the physical boundaries while having justice and fairness within that space, we will fail. But there is a tremendous opportunity of success if we're able to take that safe and just approach and really navigate ourselves within the donut. So I just want to, emphasize that from a scientific perspective, I think that is the way to go. And then also to say that we are in a very special position right now, because we have never been in such a rich maturity point on understanding the risks, but also having evidence of solutions. I mean, just to give you one statistic, we did quite recently an opinion poll among all the G20 countries, the world's 20 largest economies, showing that 72% of citizens in these countries are deeply concerned about the risks of crossing tipping points and really want to have a solution to the climate crisis. So, we have this under the surface, this overwhelming support among citizens to move much, much faster to solve the crisis. So the question then is, why aren't we solving it? Why aren't we yet bending the curve? Why are we only seeing still incremental changes and a lot of promises, but not real traction? And I think your point about finance is at the heart of this, that we need to combine everything that Kate shared here on awareness and action, and let's call it the bottom-up engagement, with some quite tough decisions, regulatory decisions, political leadership from above that sets the boundary conditions also for financial institutions. And one of the biggest promises in Glasgow was the 130 trillion financial asset redirection that Mark Carney and then all the banks and financial institutions agreed upon. Will this happen? That's the big question. Will we really see pension funds and asset owners and private banks truly phasing out investments in fossil fuels? So far, we have only disappointments, to be honest. I mean, Norway just recently agreed to, approve another 52 oil extraction projects in the Arctic. That is entirely contradictory to the political promises on climate policy that the Nordics are taking, but also in terms of what is necessary. So somehow we need to put more pressure, I think, from all stakeholders on the financial institutions, because that's ultimately the tap that will determine to a large extent the direction of how businesses evolve and how societies evolve. So I think we don't have a simple answer to your question, but definitely a much stronger focus on the financial institutions in the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say that there is so much agreement that we need to do something and we need to move fast. And you said something like it's under the surface. Well, it seems to be most of people who think that way. So it's a social contract and it's a social agreement. So it's also makes us think about from what point of view we're taking decisions. And that's a very critical point, which you both touched on in your talks. And on that note, Kate,
can I just pick up on what you just said, though? So you just asked Johan, who will finance this? Mm-hmm. And I know it's just me and Johan here, and this is a really important question, but I really feel like I'm in Don't Look Up right now. And by the way, everybody look up, right? Look up, let's look up. Why should Johan have to solve who will finance this? I know you're asking this question, and it's not a critique of the question, but his job is to inform the world of how we're destroying the living planet. Mm-hmm. Where are the financial leaders who say, right, I'm going to recognize that finance is just a construct. It's an invention. It's a human tool. And we have been misusing it for so long. Yeah. We've been using it in the interests of capital owners who then increase their ownership and get a return on a return on a return on capital. I would like to see the world's central bank sit down and say, at this meeting, we're going to begin with planetary boundaries, because that's what Johan and others have given us. And it's now our responsibility to take that as the starting point, take the donut. And now it's our responsibility at the heart of the financial system to design how we redesign finance. We don't try and make the planetary boundaries work for finance and hope that financial sector will adjust. Finance must be in service to humanity. Otherwise, what on earth are we doing on this planet? So where are the financial leaders who say, yes, I now am going to start every meeting with planetary boundaries? And it's my job to make sure that the main thing we fund is saving of life on Earth and restoring life on Earth. And it's no longer the job of the scientists to justify why this is worth investing in.
So just as an exercise, could you mention 3 financial leaders who do that?
Every head of a central bank, every former head of a central bank, Mark Carney would be great to do that with others, because a former head of a central bank knows the system but no longer feels entirely tied by today's news and today's politics and today's financial powers, and may have more space to do that.
Yeah, and he's been doing an amazing work to raise awareness on that. Yeah,
he is, but I think we are still too much in the world where we think finance has a logic that we must learn to work with. And I really want to point out that the idea that markets should always get a return on their investment, this goes against the logic of life. Life regenerates, life reinvests in itself. Finance wants a return on its return. Finance is designed for this endless growth. And it has a really high expectation of what that should be. Venture capital, the markets will punish you if you don't give them the rate of return that they want. But life regenerates at a natural rate. So we need to retrain our financial minds to land on planet Earth so that we actually create a financial system that belongs here and doesn't belong in its own utopian financial world of what it thinks it should be earning.
So that's great, thank you. And I guess the core of this is that we really, really need to understand what it means to rethink how we think and do stuff, and change the way from how we have been doing things into new ways of doing, like both of you are trying and are explaining to us really well. So in that context, just as a final question, the social factor and the just transition, are we not in danger of falling into the same old ways of doing stuff around the social factors? Is there another way that we should be approaching more equality and a just transition towards a sustainable future?
So it's essential we do. I'll answer briefly, and I'm sure Johan will contribute. It's essential that we create new opportunities for people before we shut down old options. That is what it's at the heart of a just transition. Investing in new industries that are about renewable energy, and putting in place the regulation that actually makes it make sense to start an enterprise that reuses building materials, that reinvests in the soils, that repairs and rewilds the land, rather than shutting down options so that people are left without a livelihood and without a community. Mm-hmm. So ensuring we do these things together, I'll stop there.
No, and this is a big question, and let me just add one dimension of this equity, which I find to be the most challenging one, which is that what science is showing is that we have to redefine the global commons in this phase of high risk. And the global commons in the past was, only, the high seas, Antarctica, outer space, and the atmosphere. Basically, the 4 units that are big systems that nobody owns and nobody really has to take responsibility for. But today we know that the global commons are all these tipping point systems that we all depend on for the stability on Earth. Now, this means we have to share them and we have to take responsibility for them. We have to become stewards of, if you live in Reykjavik, or if you live in Stockholm, or if you live in Amsterdam, you are equally dependent on the stability on the coral reef system, on West Antarctic ice shelf, or the Amazon rainforest. So we all need to chip in, and we cannot just point fingers. There's such a strong equity dimension of how do we take responsibility for all the global commons in a way that enables good, livable conditions for all human beings on Earth. It's like the ultimate definition of justice is a stable planet. And if you propose that, to govern the global commons, you can just see the geopolitical mess that you enter, because you would not allow someone to come into your nation state's borders and engage in stewardship of the Amazon rainforest, for example. Try that with Bolsonaro, and you know what the response will be. But there is, again, we come back to finance. We have to recognize that this will cost, and we have to pay, and we have to do it collectively. So I think there's many dimensions of equity that we need to address very, very heads on.
So I know that you guys have to leave, and believe me, I have 10 to 15 more questions, which I could totally drown you with. But thank you so much for giving us your energy and time and sharing your life's work with us. This means a lot to us, and for all of us in here and those who are listening, it really is an incredible boost and inspiration, even though the future looks as bright as it does dark. It gives us a lot of energy as well to improve the state of the world, our societies, communities, and for everyone listening, whether it's in Iceland or abroad. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And if I had a big audience, we would all be applauding now. So give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Við ætlum að taka stutt hlé og við komum tilbaka eftir 10 mínútur og hlustum á formann Festu.